thank you so much for coming to the show. It's wonderful to have you here to talk about You Brought Me the Ocean.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
So right before we got into this interview segment, I reviewed the book on the show. I told everybody that I thought it was just such a wonderful and beautiful story. Alex, I'd like to hear from you as the writer. Tell us what this book's about in your words.
Well, I describe it as a superhero origin story unlike any you've ever imagined, in that it's also a coming out story and a wet and steamy romance between a couple of teenage boys. One who's a normie and one who's discovering his superpowers.
He's been left in the position of not knowing he's got the superpowers. It's one of those unfortunate scenarios where a part of him is hidden for other reasons. It's like a double coming out, if you will. Exactly.
That was part of the fun of writing this story, was thinking about how, as superheroes, the whole superhero story acts as a metaphor for, us as queer people, when we can, accept ourselves, love ourselves, come to terms to really be true to who we are, then we discover our power. Mm-hmm. So integrating that story with a superhero story, it was like this wonderful, wonderful metaphor.
Yeah, and you're right. It's unlike any origin story we've ever seen, and especially with an established character as well.
Yep, this is the character who will become Aqualad. It was interesting working on the project that DC, this is part of a rollout of graphic novels reaching both, traditional comic audiences and also audiences who don't, normally read comic books too. So reaching out to broader audiences and looking at stories that, yes, they have a superhero aspect, but they're really focusing on the emotional story. Fiction is all about, emotional truth, and when we read fiction, really delving into the character's emotions. So our wonderful editor, Sarah Miller, was constantly emphasizing, let's look at the emotional dynamics. And then, of course, we had a wonderful artist, Jul Maroh, who was able to capture so much of that emotion on the page and in the drawing. So, yeah.
And Jul, coming over to you, I mean, this artwork is gorgeous. I mean, how would you describe the style that you've brought to this, and then what inspired that style?
Well, thank you both. I wouldn't call it gorgeous myself, but thank you so much. No, because, I'm kind of the worst seller when it comes to my own work. It's hard for me to agree when I see all the mistakes and lacks in it, especially months later. And first of all, before answering your question, I need to apologize for whoever is going to hear my terrible French accent, because I'm not a native English speaker and I haven't talked, aloud English for a while. To go back to your question, I'm not sure I have many adjectives for it, because my line in this book is more synthesized if you have to compare it to previous work. And in fact, I really like what Alex just said about emotional truth, because I try to focus on the emotions and feelings that he wrote in the script. So, I would say that all I did was to make justice to it, to Alex's writing. And the color palette is quite reduced. There is one warm atmosphere, you would say, that is divided in 3 tones. And there is one cold atmosphere with 3 other tones. And that's it. Because the purpose of it was to create a contrast between Jake's world in New Mexico, that is very dry and desertic, and the entrance of water and of love through the more watery, colors and tones that is related to Kenny in the story. And basically, my decisions on this style were taken because of the schedule we had to respect, because of the deadlines. It was my first experience dealing with such a rhythm. So the purpose was really to remain the most efficient as possible for deadlines and for emotions, as Alex had just described.
Mm-hmm. The emotional impact does come through both through the art and through the words. And the motion of the water was it all, for me as the reader, was like, just, wow, this is a perfect blending of the two elements of the creativity. How did you both come to work on this project?
Actually, that's a funny story because I received an email from that is our publisher at DC Comics, but her email ended in the spam box. So I'm actually grateful that I'm the kind of person, very neurotic, that goes every day to check on the spams, because otherwise I would have missed it. I would have missed the occasion. And so, yeah, just go check your spams because maybe Spielberg wrote to you, and so there might be an email just changing your life there. So, yeah, this is what happened on my side.
Well, I also received an email originally when the project, they were just starting to put it together. So I got this email out of the blue from DC, and they explained to me about these graphic novels. And I was sort of like, okay, but why are you reaching out to me? And then they asked, if I was interested. And so I got on the phone with the senior editor. And what she explained was that, in this series of graphic novels, they wanted one that specifically would deal with queer sexuality, and that the character that they'd chosen would be Aqualad, and that they'd asked around for who would be good to write about LGBT teens, gay teens specifically, and my name came up. And so they asked me to do a pitch for it. And I'd never worked this way. Usually as an author, it's like I write a manuscript and then I, present that to my agent, and then she presents it to publishers. So I was sort of like, okay, so what's a pitch? So I, went on the internet and looked at some sample pitches and sent them this one paragraph pitch of, what would be the story. And from the very start, they, again, were saying, we want to look at the emotional story, so don't do too much research into the character and what's been done. Don't focus so much on their superpowers, but really who they are as an individual. Nevertheless, I'm like Aqualad. I just wasn't familiar with that character, so I did some research on the internet, and that's where I saw that like a lot of these characters, they go through different iterations, different versions over the decades. And in a recent version, they had the characters set in New Mexico to get them as far away from possible as water for that contrast. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. Let me use that element. But then they had him living in Silver City, and having been in that area, traveled through that area several times, I knew there's this, a town with this funky history, kooky history of having adopted the name Truth or Consequences. And as I started thinking about the story and about being true to who you are, I thought, well, that would be another thematic element to introduce in there. So in that way, I pulled some elements from previous versions of Aqualad, but DC from the very start, they were very encouraging of saying, really make this story your own. You have freedom to shape and develop this character as you like. And so there were some other elements in there in terms of, the love triangle with Kenny and Maria, but again, giving that different twists and giving the mother a different twist. So it was, putting this all together, and then they liked the pitch. And so then after that, they asked for a longer sort of synopsis. So I came up with a 12-page synopsis, and that really was the sort of the basis for what became the script for the novel.
Mm-hmm. And it does have touchstones, because I'm not wildly familiar with Aqualad, but I watched Young Justice and was exposed to Aqualad there, and there are elements of your story that follow pieces of his origin from that as well, which I kind of liked and you've got other DC characters that make random cameos in it as well, which is also fun from just a, kind of placing it in context sort of thing.
Well, that was one of the stipulations from DC. They were like, and now you need to set this in the DC universe, whatever, however you can establish that. And so one of the things I loved about this process was just that it was so collaboratively. Usually writing a novel, it's such a lonely, solitary process of just me and the page. But in this case, working with Jul and working with Sarah Miller, I just loved that creativity, that collaboration, our creativity, feeding off of each other, stimulating each other.
And Jul, did you get to feed into the story, or how does this collaboration work between script and art as it's all formed?
I always have an opinion, I always have something to say and to fight about. So no, it went well. My opinion was always taken in account, and yeah, it was possible to discuss issues or questions, and no, I was very happy with the collaboration, I must say. Yes, it was my first time, to work on a story with a scenarist. In French, we would say that, but I'm not sure in English. So to share this kind of work like this, I had never done that before. And I'm very stubborn. So I'm a very stubborn person. But no, it went well, very well, yes.
And it was very exciting for me, as the writer, that, when I write a story, usually I have a vague idea of what the characters look like. So to actually see what Jul came up with, it was so exciting, because it was like, well, that at first it was this reaction, well, that's not how I saw them, but how did I see them? And then it's like, but yeah, I love this. I love what they're coming up with. So it was a very exciting process, very new process for me.
And if I'm not mistaken, Alex, this is your first time to work in the kind of graphic novel medium.
It is, and it was so wonderful watching Jul's process, how they came up with this, that it's taken me back to my childhood love of drawing and drawing on my own now, because it was just marvelous. And again, the way they were able to just capture the dynamism and humanity and emotion. It was just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
When Alex speaks like that, it sounds like everything was on my shoulders, when actually what he wrote in the first place was very good and very prolific, very efficient. So, of course, I did this good work because he worked so well on his side.
Given this was your first graphic novel, how did that pivot how you wrote? Because obviously you're taking away describing settings and potentially describing things that you would put into a novel, and yet they have to get on the page. Did you leave elements for Jul that would almost be like stage direction of a sort, or is that where some of the collaboration came in as well, how to represent those things?
Well, both of those. This was a whole new process for me, because even though I had that story synopsis, then when it came to breaking it down into a script, it was a real learning process for me. I had some concerns about that with DC. I told them I've never done this, and they're like, okay, we're gonna give you training for this, and they were very, very good at that. And I also got some examples of comic strips off the internet, and so that gave me sort of the format. And then working with our editor and sort of breaking it down into individual panels per page. And then it was, I can't remember exactly what the direction was, but it was basically, describe the setting, the characters, what they're thinking, feeling, dialogue, and then let the artist do their magic. And so it was, conveying, my idea of what's taking place in terms of the narrative, in terms of the story, in terms of the characters, but then really letting the artist interpret.
It sounds like a lot of work, but it also sounds like a lot of fun.
Well, it was, to watch their creative process as they were going through this. And then when the first, full illustrations, color illustrations, started coming in, it was so much fun. It was so exciting. And then it's like how Jul was able to just, crank these out on really this schedule. What was it, Jul? I think like 5 pages a week.
I don't want to think about it. I just heard. First, it was 4 pages colored, guys.
Right.
4 pages each week, and then 5. But yeah. No, it was something.
And so it's amazing if you can imagine 6 panels, an average of 6 panels per page, 4 or 5 pages per week. But Sarah and I were both like, we can't wait for Friday. We can't wait for Friday to see them come out.
I couldn't wait for Friday, but for another reason. Yeah.
How long did the book take from inception of the idea to turning it in as the final product?
Well, from the first pitch until we finally had a contract, that was about 6 months because of the DC process. And then when I started working on it, it was in the spring, and so I think we wrapped up in December. So about a year and a half on my end, and I guess for Jul maybe about a year.
Basically a year, a bit less. Yes.
One of the things that I love so much in this story is one of the tropes that you've kind of flipped in it of, in this case, Kenny, who's the star athlete, is also bullied. Whereas usually we see the jocks doing the bullying. Was that kind of in the concept from the beginning? Because I thought it was a really nice twist to show that jocks are not immune to this.
Well, I think what happens, in terms of my own creativity, is these elements come out that I hadn't exactly seen that way. So it's always wonderful when a reader says, "Oh, did you notice this?" And I'm like, "Actually, no, I didn't notice that." But that's wonderful to hear you point out. And I think what's happened is that there has been such a cultural shift, certainly in my lifetime, in terms of, even though, yes, bullying and homophobia still exist, that the increased acceptance of queer people, LGBTQ people, it's just been a dramatic cultural shift. So that it did that flip that you're mentioning, it didn't even cross my mind. It just accepted, yeah, of course there are, LGBT jocks. And, of course, we know that. We see them in the news now. So that, that's cultural shift, influence us as artists and writers. It's just, yeah, sure, that's natural. It's not a stretch anymore.
Mm-hmm. What do you both hope people take away from this story and this book?
Empowerment.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's a great word. Empowerment, for them to find their own power, for them to be true to who they are. I think part of, what's been exciting in my work has, been hearing from so many young people how my books have inspired them. And then hearing from them inspires me to do more. So it becomes this circle of inspiration and empowerment.
And also maybe the fact that in the story, it seems that the road for Jake could be already settled, for the rest of his life, if he wanted to going to college or I don't know what, etc. He has his best friend. He has already his habits. And on the contrary, his life is about to switch totally. And that's also a way to say that you can become whatever you want. There is no road that is already, that there is no destiny that is already written for you in that kind of sense.
You did exactly what a good story is supposed to do, and you left me wanting more. So any chance that we get more of Jake and Kenny coming from you two?
But also, Maria should have her own story as a martial arts superstar, I believe. That story should be written.
That would be a very cool. You could have a whole universe of stories with these characters.
I think it's going to depend on DC. I've loved working with DC, and I would love to work more with them, definitely. And then I would absolutely love to collaborate with Jul again. So there are a lot of pieces in play, but I would love for it to happen.
Excellent. Fingers crossed. Because, like I said, the book ends where it needs to end, and I know that, but I wanted more. So there's a couple of anniversaries that we should talk about since we have you both here. And Jul, for you, this year is the 10th anniversary of Blue is the Warmest Color, which was a very acclaimed book and film. For those of our listeners who may not know about that, please tell us what that's about.
Well, it's a lesbian coming out story. And at the end, she dies. No, sorry. I told you I was the worst seller of my work. And no, but I like to do this joke to say, at the end she dies, because of course that's something we know from the beginning, from the first page. So I like to do that. But no, I would say that I believe that the best publicity for this book is one email that I received one day. And because I'm very fortunate with the fact that readers keep writing to me since 10 years about this book, and that really keeps me up, I must say. And so one day there is a boy who wrote to me, and look, I'm a guy, I'm straight, I play football, the kind of details just to tell me that his reality was far from the reality from the characters from the book. And so he's telling to me, I'm all this, but look, I cried so much reading this book. So I would say that if the book made cry this straight guy playing football, maybe you should give it a try. I just want to say that.
I think that's a great selling point for the book and the film, that it can bring that emotion.
I need to meet this guy. I think he's my best ad for the book. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you feel that the work holds up after 10 years?
I would say that spreading queer stories is still very necessary, because hate crimes are still happening everywhere, not to say imprisonment and death penalty for this. So, for example, here in Italy, and many queer refugees try to make their way from Africa and Middle East. So I would say that we need to keep creating and publishing, filming queer narratives, because this is our own weapon against hate. I would say hate.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. It's so important, even now. And Alex, next year is the 20th anniversary of Rainbow Boys. As I looked at that, I'm like, 20 years? Really? Has it been that long? It's hard for me to believe. Tell us about Rainbow Boys and the trilogy that came from it.
So Rainbow Boys, it came out in 2001. And in fact, it came out right the same month as the 9/11 attacks. And I thought, well, that's so much for that book. But it has survived. And the way it came about, it was at a time where, as you know, where LGBT characters didn't hardly ever appeared in young adult fiction. And when they did, they either, ended up committing suicide or dying tragically. And so there was this message of, us as a people not deserving to exist, and that we could never be happy. And what the publisher saw as so groundbreaking about Rainbow Boys is that, the sort of literary device, the narrative device, was a love triangle between three high school senior boys, but the fact that they were connecting with each other, not just romantically, but as friends, as people of a community, and it was sort of a reflection of what was happening at the time, where more and more LGBT young people were coming out and were connecting with each other. And the first gay-straight alliances were forming in schools. And so I put in those elements. And at the same time, it was at the time of HIV, of course. And so to show, young people connecting and not just surviving, but thriving, and being able to be friends and to love, and to show, that coming of age, coming out experience of young people, that at the time many publishers wouldn't go near the book. They were like, no, we couldn't possibly publish this. Even getting the models for the front cover was a challenge. The modeling agencies, the one agency was like, well, we couldn't allow our young people to be on the cover of a book like that. And so at the time, it's hard to look back on it now and see, that yes, in many ways it was groundbreaking. And yet again, as we discussed before, it became sort of this fuel for inspiration, where it inspired more and more young people. And it also helped to open a lot of doors for other books that then came out subsequently. Julianne Peters' books and David Levithan's and Brent Hartinger's and a lot of those other early books that really blew open the door. So even though there's still nowhere near as many books being published with LGBTQ protagonists and themes, there are more and more. And it's great to see, DC is among, those publishers that, want to give that accurate portrayal of the diversity of our world, and the fact that being queer is as normal as any other orientation. And so again, symbolic of the cultural shift that's occurred. Mm-hmm. So it's exciting for me to, have been there early on and to continue being part of this process.
Yeah. And inspirational wise, I mean, this book was an inspiration to me to start writing YA too. So you've inspired not only kids, but I think you've inspired writers as well to tell the stories.
Oh, thank you. Part of what's exciting with this book, as a graphic novel is, graphic novels are booming more and more, because I think they create this bridge between the visual and prose. And so now that hopefully this book will open the door for more and more LGBTQ stories, queer artists, queer writers, so that there'll be more and more graphic novels with these themes.
Mm-hmm. I hope so. I'll ask you the same question I asked Jul. How do you think Rainbow Boys holds up after 20 years?
Well, it was funny. I was giving a presentation in October of last year, speaking at a LGBTQ youth convention, and one of the authors brought up, but they're like listening to cassettes, and they're like, what's that? And my response was, okay, we'll just read it as historical fiction. That on the one hand it does, portray a certain period in time, but when I'm writing, I'm always looking at, what are the universal themes, the enduring themes? And so love and friendship and family and connection, they're all part of the story. And so if young people today, the book was written before they were born, well, they see it as historical fiction, but the stories are still true.
Yeah, it's amazing that the early 2000s now are historical, but it's true. Since we are in Pride Month, we're asking all of our guests to share with us what Pride means to them. Jul, we'll start off with you.
Yeah, a great deal. It means a great deal. I would say that it means to stand for yourself and for your differences, to not self-abandon in some way. And it's difficult to embrace your own beauty when people in society actually expect you to be something else. So it's important to stand for the other queers and weirdos also, equally. And so I would say that it means to feel proud in a sense that says, I'm not going to feel ashamed as you'd want me to feel, and I won't take your patriarchal bullshit any longer. So it's an act of resistance for me, really.
And Alex, how about for you?
Well, I grew up at a time where homosexuality wasn't even mentioned. Occasionally maybe it was whispered about, but sex in general wasn't talked about openly. And so I grew up very, confused and lonely and ashamed, the self-hatred, all of that. And when I came out in my late teens, it was that as Jul said, letting go of the shame and saying, no, I don't have to buy into that. That may be someone else's perception, but that's not how I view myself. And so for me, pride is both finding that love for myself and then for others like me, and to be able to that again, going back to that sense of empowerment and really fully expressing who I am. And yeah, it is as Jul said, an act of resistance, defiance, when there are people trying to put us down. And I think it's a message, not only for queer people, but for non-queer people. It's like all of us, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, people are always trying to put us in boxes and tell us who we should or shouldn't be. And I think that's why, coming out stories, they're so powerful as universal stories, speaking to people about being true to who they are, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. So for me, pride goes beyond, gender identity or sexual orientation. It's really about fully embracing ourselves and others.
Thank you so much for sharing those sentiments. It's really powerful. As we start to wrap up, are there projects from either of you coming later this year that you could share some details on?
In my case, I must confess that no, I'm working on very slow projects and processes, so it's gonna take some time. But there is something coming later.
Excellent.
When I'll be 80 years old, maybe it will be out. Yes.
Well, I find that very reassuring to hear, because I'm constantly like, how long can this take? It just takes me so long to create anything. So
yeah, exactly. But in my case, it's a story taking place in the Italian Renaissance. So there is a lot of historical researches to do. And it's fascinating. So I never see the end of it, because I start the day looking for something. And at the end of the day, I discovered many details and fascinating things, but not the only thing I was looking for, So I just rule myself in this process that is very nourishing anyway, on a very personal level. But for the work, it isn't. So it's going to take some time. Yes.
And so for me, I just finishing up editing a middle grade novel that'll come out, I believe, in spring 2021. So not this year, but sometime early next year. And it's called The Greatest Superpower. So there's a comic book element in there. And then now I'm working on a memoir of my immigrant experience, being an immigrant to the United States. And as I said, inspired by Jul, I'm doing some illustrations for it. I originally thought of it, this could be a graphic memoir. And then as I started drawing, I realized I don't know how Jul did this, because it just takes so long. For me, just to do one panel can take 3 weeks. And so it's sort of like, nah, I better look at this more realistically. But looking at, what are things that I can convey on the page through a drawing that, convey so much more effectively than through words. So playing with those two forms. So I'm having a lot of fun with that.
That's so cool. I can't wait to see it, Alex. Seriously.
Yeah, I look forward to
Thank
seeing
you.
that
You
as
were
well.
the inspiration.
Thank you. Thank you. But also just to hear about your story as an immigrant. I just can't wait.
And how can people keep up with you both online to know when all these things are going to start to come out? Alex, what are your web locations?
The one that I do most is Facebook, author Alex Sanchez. Also my website, alexsanchez.com.
Fantastic. And Jul?
I have a website too, julimaroh.com, but I'm not sure it's very useful, this one. I'm more active on Instagram. That is also with my full name, even if I can disappear for weeks sometimes. But yeah, I guess I'm more active there.
Okay. We will link to those in our show notes along with the books and things that we talked about here so people can easily find them all. Thank you both so much for coming and talking about You Brought Me the Ocean. I hope this book finds a very wide audience because it's just really wonderful.
Thank you, Jeff. Sincerely.
Thank you so much, Jeff.